the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Joe Matthew, I'm Kaylee Lyons.
House Democrats find no consensus on whether to support Joe Biden as their nominee for president. Following a closed-door meeting today in Washington, we'll have the latest from the Capitol and a conversation with former Democratic Senator Bob Kerrey.
The NATO Summit opens today in Washington with President Biden set to address the alliance this hour amid questions over strategy and funding for Ukraine. We'll talk with Hagar Chemali, former member of the National Security Council.
And Nikki Haley releases her delegates, telling them to vote Trump at next week's Republican convention. We'll have more later this hour with our political panel. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio as we begin today with President Biden's fight to unite his party following a closed-door meeting among House Democrats back in town after the 4th of July break. The group failed to find consensus on whether to support the president. Earlier on Bloomberg, we spoke with Democratic Congressman Brad Sherman of California and his take on this lack of agreement within his party and what he wants to see from the president.
Some thought that no matter what, Biden should be our nominee and it shouldn't be discussed. Others thought we are to urge Biden to drop out. I took kind of a midpoint. I would like to see him for 90 minutes live at 9 p.m. In the next couple of weeks, because on September 10th, he's got his second debate with Trump, which will be 90 minutes live at 9 p.m.
Now, Senate Democrats also met today, most of them tight-lipped leaving that meeting, though Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer did have this to say about his support for Biden.
Are you confident that President Biden has what it takes to win in November and serve the next 4 years?
As I've said before, I'm with Joe. As I've said before, I'm with Joe. As I've said before, I'm with Joe.
But Senator Schumer, doesn't it leave Democrats in a...
He's with Joe. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian covering the White House for us here in Washington. This is interesting, Jordan. One thing to hear from Chuck Schumer, different to hear from the Brad Shermans of the world. Says he supports Joe Biden, didn't call on him to drop out of the race, but didn't say that he was convinced yet. Is this past 24 hours a win for Biden or not?
I mean, it's hard to say anything that's happened within the last couple of weeks is a win for Joe Biden, but in the grand scheme of things, it probably is a win. I mean, Joe Biden's going to listen to the Chuck Schumers of the world, not the Brad Shermans of the world. The only person that's going to push him out are the top levels of the Democratic Party or his family and inner circle. He's made it clear that the so-called elites, as he called them, other lawmakers, donors, aren't really registering with him. And so he's soldiering on, and he's basically challenged all these Democrats to, come at him in an organized way or step aside and get behind his bid to beat Donald Trump. And to be frank, there's just a limited amount of time for all of this to come together in one way or another. The Republican convention's next week, the Democratic convention's just 4 weeks after that. And realistically, once we get to that point, once the convention wraps, if he's the nominee at the end of that, it's kind of too late to have the conversation. That's right. And one thing to look out for was that Democrats were looking to perhaps formally nominate Joe Biden as early as July 21st. That's when a committee for the DNC meets. There was this issue with Ohio about getting on their ballot. That's now been resolved, but there was some talk about doing it early. And it'll be interesting to watch whether the Biden folks press the DNC to put that stamp of approval on, because as you said, Kaylee, once he's the nominee, they can't force him out. Earlier today, House Speaker Mike Johnson had this to say about President Biden and whether the 25th Amendment, this is something that's coming back around again now as part of this conversation, or the amendment focusing on presidential succession would be appropriate in this case. Let's listen.
In good conscience, if I was in the Biden cabinet, I would be wrestling with that question, because I would know what we all know now, that Joe Biden is not up to the task. Desperate times call for desperate measures. I think the 25th Amendment is appropriate here. I think the notion that the 25th Amendment would be appropriate here is something that most Republicans and, frankly, most Americans would agree with if they understood the process and how that works.
You covered the Trump White House as well. We've come full circle with this 25th Amendment conversation, haven't we?
That's right. Yeah. I mean, look, this is a Republican speaker looking to score some political points off of Joe Biden. One, I might mention, who got out-negotiated in a spending deal by someone who he believes is not mentally fit to be president. So, yeah, what does that say? But look, this is a clear indication that, this issue isn't going away. And
Clearly.
Biden can say, look, we're moving past this. We're going on to the nomination. But at heart, he's still an 81-year-old guy. He could have another lapse like he did at the debate. And once he becomes a nominee, there's nothing they can do. This is not like some sort of controversy you move past. It is Father Time who remains undefeated.
All right, Bloomberg's Jordan Fabian, thank you so much. Now, meantime, the NATO Summit is officially underway here in Washington, with world leaders gathering for the alliance's 75th anniversary. President Biden is set to address them momentarily, and we will bring you his remarks when they begin. First, though, joining us now is Bloomberg's Courtney McBride. So, Courtney, we are awaiting to see what President Biden has to say. What is he likely looking for in terms of tangible outcomes from this summit? What are any of the allied countries looking for?
Well, certainly Ukraine is the top priority and the focus of, I think, what we would consider the deliverables for the summit. The U.S. administration is really looking to provide a clear path toward membership for Ukraine. They've described it as a bridge, which our understanding is meant to be irreversible, including not just additional weapons for Ukraine, but efforts to shore up its defense industry and really to put it in a position to join NATO when conditions allow.
We heard from the Secretary of State earlier today. Antony Blinken said this about NATO's commitment to supporting Ukraine.
The aggression continues. Our commitment, and not just our commitment, the commitment of dozens of countries around the world to Ukraine and to its defense, that continues, and our commitment to Ukraine's success as a strong country. That continues, and that will be manifested in very concrete ways over the next couple of days at the NATO Summit.
That support, that commitment is already manifesting itself in some of your reporting when it comes to air defenses, our commitment to the F-16 program. How about these takeaways for Ukraine?
Certainly. The Ukrainians are constantly looking for additional defenses. We've seen Russian attacks, for instance, on a children's hospital this week. They are looking for more Patriot batteries to protect cities, to protect military installations.
Are they getting them?
Well, the hope and the expectation is that they will get them, as the summit continues and allies come together. F-16s have been a long road in terms of providing the aircraft and getting the pilots trained, but that is something that is moving forward.
We'll keep our eyes on the terminal for your reporting this week. I know it's a big one for you. Great to have Courtney McBride with us as we open this NATO summit today in Washington. Just as Fed Chair Jay Powell wraps his first day of two in testimony on Capitol Hill on the Senate side today before the Banking Committee, where he gave investors few clues about the timing of rate moves, but saying inflation is moving in the right direction.
Inflation has eased notably over the past couple of years. More good data would strengthen our confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. The labor market appears to be fully back in balance. Labor market conditions have cooled considerably compared to where they were 2 years ago. We're well aware that we now face two-sided risks. If we loosen policy too late or too little, we could hurt economic activity. If we loosen policy too much or too soon, then we could undermine the progress on inflation. We continue to make decisions meeting by meeting. The likely direction does seem to be in, as we make more progress on inflation and as the labor market remains strong, we begin to loosen policy at the right moment.
Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe. Amara, thanks for being back with us on this day one. Is this the dovish Powell you expected?
Well, I mean, we certainly did see a bit of a shift in Chairman Powell's comments today, a bit of a shift in tone. You know, for the last several weeks following the last Fed meeting, you saw Fed officials really talking about how they needed more confidence that inflation was moving down to their target before they cut. And you saw Chair Powell still saying that today, but you also saw him talking a lot more about the labor market, the signs of cooling that we've been seeing in the labor market, and how he and other Fed officials are increasingly taking taking that into account, right? The Fed has a dual mandate both to control inflation and also promote maximum employment. And now that inflation has cooled a lot, they're focusing a lot more on what's happening in the labor market and signs of cracks that could be emerging.
Well, and we certainly heard Democrats today pressing Powell on whether those cracks are becoming more apparent and could merit a rate cut in the future. But that also begs the question of the timing around the election. That's something that Republican Senator Kevin Cramer warned Powell about. Take a listen.
Perception matters, and so I would just submit to you, and you haven't said you're going to do this. I don't have any reason to believe you'll do this, but any move to lower interest rates or move interest rates either direction before November 5th could certainly be a bad perception, even if there's a strong push to do that. I know you understand that, but I just want you to know that as long as you remain independent, I'll be on your side.
For our listeners on radio, you did see a moment there in which the chairman's eyebrows shot up. Amara, how does politics factor into Powell and the rest of the FOMC's thinking, if at all?
Well, you know, what Chair Powell has said, what many of the Fed officials have said, is that what they consider when setting policy is what is best for the economy, what is going to control inflation, what is going to make sure that Americans have jobs. They really have emphasized time and time again that they do not allow partisan politics to creep into their mission and influence what they're going to do. That being said, we are in an election year, and there are some economists, some Fed watchers who say, look, as we get closer to the election, it could be harder for the Fed to actually cut rates because of the fear of potentially looking political. Some Fed watchers talk about how, you know, the reality is politics are a part of what's happening in Washington and the optics surrounding the Fed. And so, you know, the Fed says that they're insulated from that they don't consider it, but it is something that Fed watchers are talking about.
Well, it's kind of interesting as you consider the dual mandate here. I guess we got one of them in balance, as you mentioned earlier. But in terms of inflation, we've got an important report coming up on Thursday with CPI. At what point, Amara, do we call this a trend? Could Thursday be it?
Well, I think the inflation data recently has definitely been moving in the right direction. And you heard Chair Powell talk about that today, how the last two inflation reports have been good. But, you know, Fed officials aren't going to get overly excited about any one data point. They really have said that they want to see several good inflation reports before they become convinced that it's okay for them to cut rates, because you may remember in the first quarter of this year, we did start to see inflation data that was really discouraging, that looked like inflation could have been heating up again. And so economists are expecting that the CPI report on Thursday will continue to show that inflation is moving in the right direction, but I don't think you should expect that to particularly move Fed officials at this point.
All right, Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe, thank you so much for joining us. Much to look forward to in the House from Chairman Powell tomorrow. Elsewhere, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen was in the House today, testifying before the Financial Services Committee and pressed by New York Republican Mike Lawler on her meetings with President Biden.
As a cabinet secretary, have you noticed any mental or cognitive decline in any of these meetings?
The president is extremely effective in the meetings that I've been in with him. That includes many international meetings that are multi-hour, like his meetings with President Xi.
Yellen also said she wouldn't comment on her own meetings with the president because they were private. And she said there's been no discussion among cabinet members about invoking the 25th Amendment of the Constitution, which covers the potential removal of a president due to disability. And of course, Joe, as we mentioned earlier in the program, that was something that was suggested by House Speaker Mike Johnson earlier today.
Yes, indeed. I suspect you'll hear that again. And that's why people are paying such close attention to what would be kind of a routine speech that we're about to witness from Joe Biden, marking the 75th anniversary here in the opening of the NATO Summit. We've seen some of the dignitaries entering the room here, and the president is set to speak at any time now. Dr. Jill Biden has sat down along with former Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the front row, and we'll be hearing from Joe Biden what's expected to be a 10 to 15-minute speech here. Kaylee, no major calisthenics, but people are watching every word.
Absolutely. The stakes are high, not just for the alliance, but, of course, for the president himself and his reelection campaign. This is going to be very closely watched today, as will his press conference later, which is expected on Thursday. It's a critical few days for the president. We'll have more on that and bring you the president's remarks live here on Bloomberg TV and radio as we see more people entering the stage now. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Former President Donald Trump says he has yet to make a final decision on who his vice presidential pick will be. But he's telling Fox News that he plans to make an announcement in the coming week. We caught up with Republican Senator Thom Tillis of North Carolina, who weighed in on Trump's hunt for a running mate.
I'm looking for somebody that guarantees Trump's win in November, somebody that has experience, obviously, in the political realm is very, very important. I think that probably among the short list we'll have that, but it's got to be somebody that helps him win in battlegrounds, that helps the president have a good electoral outcome in the battleground states, and by that I mean President Trump.
And Donald Trump is campaigning with someone we understand to be on the short list for VP. This evening in Florida, he will be joined by the senator from Florida, Marco Rubio, which potentially could create some problems since they're both Florida residents.
He was asked about that on Sunday and made it clear that he hadn't even thought about this idea of moving, which I guess would be required, and has some doubting whether he's really on a short list. But it was the Washington Post just yesterday that said it was down to two, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio. They still allowed for the possibility of Doug Burgum to be involved there. But the former president, I should say, will be in Pennsylvania leading into the convention this weekend. That could also be a venue for announcing this. But who knows? Maybe we show up in Milwaukee for the big reveal at the RNC.
Maybe it'll be a surprise. Certainly, this entire vice presidential contest has been drawn out extensively. President Trump, former President Trump, has often teased that he has a number of people in contention, and yet we don't yet know exactly who he has picked. People have described it as the apprentice-fying, if you will, of the vice presidency.
The apprentice-ification. We'll see if there are any former, I don't think I said that right, by the way, former contestants actually at the convention. It wouldn't be the first time we saw that at a Trump convention. We're keeping our eyes, by the way, on what's happening right now at the Andrew Mellon Auditorium in downtown Washington, not far from where we're seated right now. A good view for you on Bloomberg TV as we speak. It appears they're showing a quick video before President Biden speaks to the crowd. But this is the moment that he's been waiting for throughout the day. Kayleigh, having met with dignitaries, many of his administration officials have been very busy in the early stages of this summit with a lot of sideline meetings, a lot of bilateral meetings that are leading up to the leaders themselves. We saw them take a family photo a short time ago. President standing right next to Jens Stoltenberg, who's had some pretty strong words about the alliance, the Secretary General, leading up to this moment. You see, if you're with us on Bloomberg TV, the big 75 behind the stage. This is supposed to be a huge moment, Kayleigh, for this alliance on its 75th anniversary, but it comes with a lot of uncertainty in politics, not just here in the U.S., but throughout Europe.
Yeah, for Joe Biden himself, not only is this a big moment for NATO and for the U.S. president as the leader of the free world, but of course someone who is campaigning to be president for a second term, with ongoing concerns about his age and mental acuity, making his speech today in the press conference that will happen on Thursday all the more important as Democrats, some of them at least, discuss that they need to see more from President Biden, and this is what they've had to say about his age.
Look, we've got 4 months between now and November, and the president will continue to make his case.
I think the president has is doing the work to take into consideration all of the concerns from what he admitted was a horrible debate performance.
I'm hearing discussions and legitimate questions about the president, and I continue to listen.
I've heard concerns from colleagues. I think that the president needs to address them, along with, more importantly, frankly, the concerns that I've heard from people around the country.
I would say to the president, the challenge is to you. Show us in the way you campaign that you can effectively beat Donald Trump.
Senators Dick Durbin, LaFonza Butler, Richard Blumenthal, Sherrod Brown, and Raphael Warnock all speaking to us earlier today in the hallways of Congress, some of whom, of course, served with President Biden in the U.S. Senate, like the next gentleman we're going to speak with, former Senator who did serve alongside Joe Biden. Former Nebraska Senator Bob Kerrey is with us, at one time a presidential candidate, now co-chair of the Concord Coalition. Senator, it's good to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. As we wait to hear from Joe Biden, and I'll warn you in advance that we might be interrupted by his speech. You served with him in his prime, and you've witnessed this debate that we're going through these past couple of weeks since the presidential debate. How much time does he have to right the ship on this?
I don't know. I actually don't know. First of all, I appreciate you calling me a gentleman. I mean, it's so rare that somebody does that to me that I almost burst into tears. I don't know. I mean, this has never happened before. And this is not one bad debate. I keep hearing these guys say, oh, just one bad debate. No, it was not one bad debate. Coming out of this debate, he said something he actually said wasn't happening before, which was, age is a problem for me. Previously, I can do everything. No. I'm having trouble walking. Okay. I'm having trouble with some of my speech, some of my debate. I'm having trouble. And it's age related. It's not, not caused by, anything other than that. That's what he said, and he's right. And you can see it. And what you saw in the debate was something even worse. Not for a normal, like an 80-year-old me, I space out all the time. But I'm not president. And then there's deep concerns as a consequence. A large number of Americans now believe he's too old. You can't fix that. So it's a huge decision for him because he's the only one that can set the stage for the convention looking for an alternative to him. And I thought, Carville had a piece in the Times this morning that I think set it up quite right. But it begins with with President Biden, and there's a big difference between I'm going to fight and I'm going to persist and stubbornness that's deep connected with a rational observation of the facts. So I've done both. I've been stubborn and haven't listened to good advice. And I've been up against difficult things and know that I got to persist. And it unfortunately, it's beginning to feel like a little bit more of the former than the latter. But again, he's the only one that can do it. And the longer he waits, the more difficult it's going to be for him to set in motion a process that's open, transparent, and allows the Democratic Party to select somebody else. He's in charge of that. And at the moment, I'm going to fight on. And that fight on stuff makes me nervous. You can't fight on and overcome age. If after this conversation, if after this conversation, and he's just 1 year older than me, and I disconnect, and I go off my Zoom, and I die, you know what they're not going to say tomorrow morning? That was a surprise. Oh, man. It happens when you're 80. Well, no, you go to sleep, you don't wake up. It happens. And it rarely happens when you're 40, 50, 60. And I think Joe understands that. I think the president understands that. But I don't think he can cover himself in glory and say, I'm going to fight on here and show you and overcome age. You want to ask a question. I'm
do you
talking
think,
too long.
Sir, that the president has an adequate understanding of his position in this race? Not only have we heard him say that it was just a bad night for him, we have also heard him say repeatedly, including in last week's ABC interview, that he does not believe the polling, that he firmly believes that he can beat Donald Trump again. Do you share that belief?
No, I think he can beat him because of Trump, but I don't. You can't have your own poll and ignore every single other poll because it's giving you news other than the news you want to hear. That's delusion. That's not a rational assessment of the facts. And by the way, Stephen also asked him, have you watched the debate? And he almost said yes. And then he said, no, I haven't. That's wrong. He should watch that debate and see what he looks like and reach his own conclusion about what's going on. Again, I said, he's the only one that gets to make this decision. And it may be he stays in the race and he wins. I don't know. But boy, when you got over 70% of the American people, black, white, Democrat, Republican, saying he's too old, you can't fix that with a fiery speech at some event or a wonderful celebration of the importance of NATO and his contribution to it. During his term of office, NATO expanded. We got Finland, we got Sweden into NATO. I didn't think that would ever happen. And those two countries know how to fight. They're real deterrents in that force. So there's a lot that's going on that he can celebrate. But boy, I'm smelling delusion, not a rational assessment on a guy willing to fight on. And I worry about that because I get plenty of delusion. And I can tell you that there are moments I think I may am leaning in a little too hard and being optimistic about being able to get this done.
Senator, let me be the first to say that we're banking on you waking up tomorrow. But you mentioned this Carville op-ed in the New York Times. James Carville writes, mark my words, Joe Biden is going to be out of the 2024 presidential race, whether he is ready to admit it or not. I don't know if you agree with him, but his proposal here is something that he refers to as a super democratic process. A new nominee starting with 4 regional town halls to be moderated by former Presidents Obama and Clinton. You're talking about delusions right now. Are Democrats in a fantasy about this idea, bypassing Kamala Harris and taking the show on the road?
Oh, no, it's quite the opposite. I mean, first of all, when I hear James Carville say, mark my words, I know he's a Cajun. So I smile when I hear that come out of his mouth. But I think what he's proposing is a transparent process. Certainly the vice president will be a part of that. But if it gets rigged in her favor and she becomes a nominee because Biden pushes it, that's not good for her. That's not giving her a level playing field to be the nominee of the Democratic Party as president. It just isn't. I don't see a lot of enthusiasm in the United States today, Democrat and Republican, for Washington, D.C. rigging things and setting it up to have an outcome different than what everybody else wants. So it would be a terrible mistake in my view. I think Carville's got that part figured out. I don't know. I have no capacity to predict what President Biden's going to do. I can only assess what I see, and what I assess is this is crossing over from persistence, to basically a delusion. And I'll repeat, we all have delusions. But the only people that don't are the guys on the street corner saying the world's going to come to an end. All the rest of us get through life by deluding ourselves that bad things aren't going to happen.
Well, Senator, if you think that this is kind of a deluded vision, he also has maintained that he is doing this because of concern over the future of democracy, something I'm sure we may be about to hear from him as he gets ready to speak and address NATO allies at the summit here in Washington. But we're all just going to be paying attention more so to his delivery than the words he says, just like we're talking about his age, not the policy that he or Donald Trump would likely bring to a second term. Is that a disservice done to American people who are likely trying to vote on issues, not age and personality?
No, I don't think it is. But first of all, the facts say that both the Republican and the Democratic Party are corrupt when it comes to figuring out who their nominee for president is going to be. And it's a big problem. And it's a solvable problem. It's a big problem. So far be it from me to sit here and say, I celebrate democracy as a consequence of the way the Democratic Party and the Republican Party behave when it comes to selecting their nominee for president. If anything, it's a flaw in the process.
Senator, you've been very open with us here, and we appreciate your time and your
I'm
candor.
on drugs. I hope you understand.
Well, I'll have what you're having. In the meantime, as an 80-year-old man, what do you make, and a longtime politician, of the idea of making a cognitive test required for both sides in this case?
I think I don't know. I think, what do you get out of it? A couple of doctors' opinions. They're going to leap up with a Nobel Prize winning conclusion that he's 81 years old. And as he said in North Carolina, I have trouble sometimes in my debates. And who doesn't?
Sure.
The older you get. So I don't find that to be compelling. And by the way, I've heard some people say, let's have an age limit. If Warren Buffett decides he wants to be president tomorrow, he's got my support. So I don't think age necessarily is an indicator that you're unable to do a job like this. But in this particular case, age may end up being the most important issue in the campaign, and it shouldn't be. It just shouldn't be. The policy differences between Biden and Trump are stark. Let alone the fact that Trump is a felon 34 times over. I mean, Tillis could say, I want to find some vice president that can help Trump win. He's not going to be able to help him undo the stain of being a convicted felon, undo the stain of what he did on January 6th, undo the stain of being found guilty of sexual assault by a jury of men and women of his peers. So those are, and the economic plans. I mean, we were in the toilet the last year he was in office because he was, much of the time, denying that COVID was a very big problem. Anyway, I think it makes it difficult for Biden and Trump to do what they need to do, which is say, if I get elected, this is what I'm going to do. And it's as I said, it may end up with Joe winning in a landslide. But if all you're doing is looking at facts, you'd bet it the other way at the moment.
All right, former Senator Bob Kerrey, we appreciate your time today, sir, and your candor. He's co-chair of the Concord Coalition. We appreciate it. Now, as we're discussing concern around President Biden's age, that is a conversation that U.S. allies are having as well. We asked the Latvian Foreign Minister, Baiva Braja, speaking with us earlier about Biden's health and mental acuity, and she said this.
I've met President Biden both when I worked at NATO, and I look forward to seeing him tomorrow at the summit.
Yeah.
And I wish at age of 81 I would be as strong as he is. We all have our ups and downs, you know, at some moment, so sure. I don't expect it to lead any kind of tragic outcome or anything. Mm-hmm. But quite clearly, American democracy will be able to handle all the challenges, and you will find the way through this or through other challenges.
We, of course, are awaiting remarks from President Biden addressing NATO this evening, and we'll bring you those when we get them here on Bloomberg TV and radio. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg is addressing those gathered now. Joining us as we await the president's remarks is Hagar Chemali, the former director of Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council and Greenwich Media Strategies founder and CEO. Hagar, always great to have you. It's such an interesting moment for this 75th anniversary of NATO, the summit to be happening here in Washington, as not only we're talking about a weakened U.S. president with these questions around his age and health, but also a French president that just had a very complicated election process go down with first victories for the far right, then the far left. We just had turnover in the UK government. We've seen election losses for Olaf Scholz of Germany as well. How strong is this alliance, or more specifically, the leaders within it?
Well, so to answer the first part of your question, the alliance remains very strong because there is still that very pending threat that's coming from the Russians. And if anything, they're talking this summit about expanding further and giving a path to Ukraine, what they call an irreversible path to Ukraine to have membership. And so, again, they're on this path of continuing to expand. They're very well aware of the threats that are posed and the need to stay together. That said, like you noted, there have been all these leaders that are struggling at home. The French, as you said, the UK, Germany, and President Biden here as well. But that's not abnormal as I find it. I mean, it is a year with a lot of elections and a lot of turmoil or volatility. And certainly you've seen a lot of this request for change. That's the common theme with a lot of these elections. In UK, the Labour Party, that's the first time they're coming in 14 years, or after 14 years under the Conservative rule. You have in France these elections that kind of went all over the place, that stunned everybody, with the far right gaining seats and then the far left. And yet, regardless of who's in power, the far right is still really gaining popularity in France and in Germany as well, as you've noticed. And all of this highlights discontent. And discontent can undermine stability. But that said, I don't see it. I don't want to be over alarmist about it. I don't see it shaking things so much to its core that I fear NATO's future. I do fear NATO's future, or at least the U.S. relationship with NATO, if Trump becomes president again, because he's been very clear about his views on NATO. That's something that I would be concerned with, but that's not something you're seeing in the shift in leadership in Europe in particular.
Hagar, I'm glad you're with us, because I want to go a little bit further down this road on Ukrainian membership. It's something that the Secretary of State talked about earlier today. Here's Antony Blinken. We'll have you react.
As things move forward, Ukraine has what it needs to stand strongly on its own feet, militarily, economically, democratically. And we're on a very good pathway to do just that. Ukraine's success as a strong, independent, successful country is the best possible rebuke to the aggression that continues to be committed by Putin and Russia against Ukraine.
So he says we're on a very good pathway to do just that, but we never get more than talk of a pathway here. And when we spoke earlier with Latvia's foreign minister, she made clear, as we've heard many times, that this is not a real conversation until the war in Ukraine has come to an end. So will this summit be more specific about this and a timeline or not?
Not really. It's more about making it a promise, making it seem as an inevitability that Ukraine will become a member, and that would be the message to Putin. Remember, when this whole thing started, when Putin invaded Ukraine, a big part of that was anger at Ukraine's desire to lean toward Europe, toward the West, and toward NATO in particular. And there are many other reasons that we could dive into later, but that was a big part of it, that Putin wanted the opposite to happen. He wanted the fracturing of NATO. He didn't want Ukraine leaning toward Europe and NATO and the West. And the opposite is happening. And so that's why that message is so important. But as the foreign minister of Latvia astutely noted, as you said, until the war ends, it's hard to see how you include a member who is actively at war, because if you do, then automatically that means you're signing up for that war yourself and for the defense of that country, even more so than we are already trying to support. You're talking about much more of an investment there. And that said, Ukraine still has moves to make on democracy and democracy reforms and corruption in particular. And so perhaps they're hoping that both of those items will track at the same time, the end of the war and those reforms.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hagar, obviously the allies are very much focused on Russia. Of course, that's what this alliance was formed for in the first place 75 years ago. But more frequently now, we are talking about not just Russia as the power, but its relationships with others, including, say, China and Iran. To what extent should they feature into the conversations at the meeting this week?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that. Not a lot of people ask about that. I like to call it the club of baddies, and that Russia is aligning, and so they're amassing this relationship with China, this bromance with Kim Jong-un, this certainly this relationship with Iran, all of which, by the way, are not natural relationships for Russia. If you look at its history, these are not partners of Russia in its past. They are giving lethal weapons to Myanmar's military. Why? Because it's all part of creating and solidifying this club of baddies. And when you have that kind of, this is just in general from a national security perspective, from the 60,000-foot level, when you have an axis like that growing and affirming itself, and you could even look at the BRICS a little bit like that. I mean, they're trying at least to undermine the dollar. They're trying to create this counterweight to the West. It is concerning because they are stronger together. They really genuinely are. They can be very weak alone when they're isolated, or if countries are poor, like those like North Korea and Iran, for example, or under sanctions. But when they're together, they really are stronger because they share technology. They can buy and sell weapons or share weapons. They can share humanitarian aid. They can try and circumvent sanctions, and so on and so forth. And so that only reinforces the need for NATO at a time like that, when you see that anti-West axis building further.
Hagar, we need to ask you about the elephant in the room here. The only reason why a lot of people are going to be watching this speech is because of questions about Joe Biden's health, his age, his mental acuity. And we've been asking a lot of folks around the summit what they're hearing, whether world leaders do trust Joe Biden is up to the job, because they see, frankly, a lot more of him than a lot of lawmakers, for instance, on Capitol Hill. What are you hearing in the private conversations? What are people going to be talking about as they watch this speech?
Well, on one hand, yes, listen, and of course, this has become the center of talking point. And I smile a little bit because sometimes I feel it's as though, folks haven't had eyes and ears for the last 2 years. I mean, it wasn't, I know that President Biden had a bad night at the debate, but to me, his performance wasn't terribly shocking. It was just right there in our faces, is I think what it is. And so when I've seen a lot of pundits and columnists, and now you have 7 Democratic officials calling for him to step aside in the election, and I keep thinking to myself, where have you been the last year or so? And I believe from what I've seen from European press, and from European colleagues, is that they have a similar view to that. They kind of think to themselves, well, on one hand, it's because many of them hope that he stays. The European allies, they missed that relationship that when Trump was in office. Trump doesn't have that same emphasis on alliances, or he doesn't value our alliances, in particular with Europe, as much. And they know that Biden does. So they have this hope that Biden wins anyway. And they're stressed about it, but they're not so. The stress that I see hasn't come so much from about age. It's that they see a growing base in the United States that's far to the right, that genuinely likes Trump, and that's what they're mostly concerned with.
Well, we're going to be hearing from him momentarily. Hagar Chemali, appreciate your time and your insights, as always, on Bloomberg. Stay with us as NATO kicks off its 2024 summit in Washington. Remarks ahead from President Biden in the nation's capital. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio.
must get behind him. We must support him. Donald Trump's election would be extremely destructive to American democracy. We have no choice.
House Democrats are very confident in the agenda that we have been a part of for the past few years.
I believe Democrats will win up and down the ballot. Joe Biden will be reelected, and we're going to take the House.
I've been with him in the last few weeks, and he talked to autos to me better than some of the people I know in Michigan.
You know, the fighting spirit and pride and courage that served the country so well 4 years ago helped Joe Biden win. We'll bring the ticket down this time. He just has to step down because he can't win.
A few House Democrats earlier discussing their opinions on President Biden's fitness for office following a closed-door meeting, a family conversation earlier today in Washington about what to do next, and a conversation that seemed to result in no consensus. Joining us now is our political panel, Maura, Gillespie, founder and principal at Bluestack Strategies, and Alvin Jordan, Democratic strategist, with us at the table. Great to see you both as we stand by for some words from Joe Biden. He's going to be speaking from the NATO Summit momentarily, and we want to bring you some of that address. But Alvin, I'm curious your thoughts. A very interesting wrinkle in the story in the last 24 hours that seemed to maybe turn back in Joe Biden's direction a bit came courtesy of the Squad, AOC, I'm behind Joe Biden, he's our nominee, and the CBC, an important conversation he had with members of the Congressional Black Caucus last evening that seemed to say that we're the ones who brung you and we're ready to do it again. What do you make of this moment?
I make that it is a nice to see as far as everyone kind of being, a unified front, which seems like the first time in a long while. And it's odd that this is the kind of piece that pulls the party closer together, seemingly, even though there are obviously some.
Alvin, I hate to interrupt you right now, but Joe Biden has just gotten to the podium. Let's listen to the president live from the NATO Summit in Washington on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Welcome. In 1949, the leaders of 12 countries, including President Truman, came together in this very room. History was watching. It had been 4 years since the surrender of the Axis powers and the end of the most devastating war the world had ever known. Here, these 12 leaders gathered to make a sacred pledge to defend each other against aggression, provide their collective security, and to answer threats as one, because they knew to prevent future wars, to protect democracies, to lay the groundwork for lasting peace and prosperity, they needed a new approach. They needed to combine their strengths. They needed an alliance. And here they signed the Washington Treaty and created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the single greatest, most effective defensive alliance in the history of the world. Mr. Secretary General, leaders of NATO countries, foreign and defense ministers, representatives from partner nations and the European Union, and members of Congress, distinguished guests, welcome to the 2024 NATO Summit. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to host you in this milestone year, to look back with pride at all we've achieved and look ahead to our shared future with strength and with resolve. Together, we rebuilt Europe from the ruins of war, held high the torch of liberty during long decades of the Cold War. When former adversaries became fellow democracies, we welcomed them into the alliance. When war broke out in the Balkans, we intervened to restore peace and stop ethnic cleansing. And when the United States was attacked on September 11th, our NATO allies, all of you, stood with us, invoking Article 5 for the first time in NATO history, treating an attack on us as an attack on all of us. A breathtaking display of friendship that the American people will never, ever forget. Through all this history, when great changes occurred, people would ask, can NATO adapt? And every time we proved we could adapt, and we did, evolving our strategies to stay ahead of threats, reaching out to new partners to increase our effectiveness. And here with us today are countries from the Indo-Pacific region. They're here because they have a stake in our success, and we have a stake in theirs. Today, NATO is more powerful than ever, 32 nations strong. For years, Finland and Sweden were among our closest partners. Now they have chosen to officially join NATO, and because of the power and meaning of Article 5 guarantee, that's the reason. It was the most important aspect of the alliance in 1949, and it is still the most important aspect. I'd also note, Finland and Sweden joined the alliance not just because their leaders sought it, because their citizens called for it in overwhelming numbers. Remember, NATO's character is fundamentally democratic, always has been and always must continue to be. And today, NATO is better resourced than it ever has been. I want to pause on this because it's significant. In the year 2020, the year I was elected president, only 9 NATO allies were spending 2% of their defense GDP on defense. This year, 23 will spend at least 2%. And some will spend more than that. And the remaining countries that have not yet reached that milestone will get there soon. This remarkable progress, proof that our commitment is broad and deep, that we're ready, that we're willing, we're able to deter aggression and defend every inch of NATO territory across every domain: land, air, sea, cyber, and space. My friends, it's good that we're stronger than ever, because this moment in history calls for our collective strength. Autocrats want to overturn global order, which is by and large kept for nearly 80 years and counting. Terrorist groups continue to plot evil schemes to cause mayhem and chaos and suffering. In Europe, Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine continues, and Putin wants nothing less than Ukraine's total subjugation, to end Ukraine's democracy, to destroy Ukraine's culture, and to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we know Putin won't stop at Ukraine, but make no mistake, Ukraine can and will stop Putin. Especially with our full collective support. They have our full support. Even before Russian bombs were falling in Ukraine, the alliance acted. I ordered the U.S. reinforcements at NATO's eastern flank. More troops, more aircraft, more capabilities. And now the United States has more than 100,000 troops on the continent of Europe. NATO moved swiftly as well, not only reinforcing the 4 existing battle groups in the east, but also adding 4 more in Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, essentially doubling NATO's strength on the eastern flank. Together, we've built a global coalition to stand with Ukraine. Together, we provided significant economic and humanitarian assistance. And together, we've supplied Ukraine with weapons it needs to defend itself: tanks, armored fighting vehicles, air defense systems, long-range missiles, and millions of munitions. The United States and nearly 24 allied partners have signed a bilateral security agreements with Ukraine, and more countries will follow. Today, I'm announcing an historic donation of air defense equipment for Ukraine. The United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, and Italy will provide Ukraine with the equipment for 5 additional strategic air defense systems. And in the coming months, the United States and our partners intend to provide Ukraine with dozens of additional tactical air defense systems. The United States will make sure that when we export critical air defense interceptors, Ukraine goes to the front of the line. They will get this assistance before anyone else gets it. All told, Ukraine will receive hundreds of additional interceptors over the next year, helping protect Ukrainian cities against Russian missiles, Ukrainian troops facing air attacks on their front lines. Make no mistake, Russia is failing in this war. More than 2 years into Putin's war of choice, his losses are staggering. More than 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded. Nearly 1 million Russians, many of them young people, have left Russia because they no longer see a future in Russia. And Kyiv, remember, fellas and ladies, supposed to fall in 5 days, remember? Was still standing 2.5 years later and will continue to stand. All of we allies knew that before this war, Putin thought NATO would break. Today, NATO is stronger than it's ever been in its history. When this senseless war began, Ukraine was a free country. Today, it is still a free country. And the war will end with Ukraine remaining a free and independent country. Russia will not prevail. Ukraine will prevail. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a pivotal moment for Europe, for the transatlantic community, and I might add for the world. Let's remember, the fact that NATO remains the bulwark of global security did not happen by accident. It wasn't inevitable. Again and again at critical moments, we chose unity over disunion, progress over retreat, freedom over tyranny, hope over fear. Again and again we stood behind our shared vision of a peaceful and prosperous transatlantic community. Here at this summit, we gather to proclaim NATO is ready and able to secure that vision today and well into the future. Let me say this. An overwhelming bipartisan majority of Americans understand that NATO makes us all safer. The fact that both Democratic and Republican parties are represented here today is a testament to that fact. The American people know that all the progress we've made in the past 75 years has happened behind the shield of NATO. And the American people understand what would happen if there was no NATO. Another war in Europe, American troops fighting and dying, dictators spreading chaos, economic collapse, catastrophes. Americans, they know we're stronger with our friends. And we understand this is a sacred obligation. As President Reagan put it, and I quote, "If our fellow democracies are not secure, we cannot be secure. If you are threatened, we are threatened. If you're not at peace, we cannot be at peace." Reagan knew it then, and we know it now. Our nations will continue to keep faith with what we pledged in years to come. Now, if you'll indulge me, I'd like to end my remarks in a slightly unusual way. NATO is an alliance of nations, but also made up of leaders. And one person in particular has done an extraordinary job leading NATO for the last decade. Secretary General Stoltenberg, would he come forward? So much of the progress we've made in the alliance is thanks to the Secretary. He's a man of integrity and intellectual rigor, a calm temperament in a moment of crisis, a consummate diplomat who works with leaders across the political spectrum and always finds a way to keep us moving forward. Secretary, you've guided this alliance through one of the most consequential periods in its history. I realize, I was talking to your wife, I personally asked you to extend your service. Forgive me. And you put your own plans on hold. When the Russian war in Ukraine began, you didn't hesitate. Today, NATO is stronger, smarter, and more energized than when you began. And 1 billion people across Europe and North America, indeed the whole world, will reap the rewards of your labor for years to come in the form of security, opportunity, and greater freedom. For these reasons, I'm pleased to award you the highest civilian honor the United States can bestow, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Ask a military to come forward. I'm asking to read the citation.
The President of the United States of America awards this Presidential Medal of Freedom to Jens Stoltenberg. A visionary statesman and ceaseless defender of democracy, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has guided the NATO alliance through the most consequential decade for European security since World War II. When Vladimir Putin launched his brutal assault on the people of Ukraine, betting that NATO would break, Secretary General Stoltenberg proved him wrong. Under his stewardship, NATO has become stronger and more united than ever, and Americans for generations to come will benefit from the safer world he helped create. He demonstrates that the core truth of the alliance is as powerful now as it was 75 years ago. Together, we are stronger.
President Biden speaking at the NATO Summit here in Washington, ending his remarks by bestowing the Presidential Medal of Freedom on NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, who he brought up on the stage during his remarks after he said a number of things, including talking about how Ukraine can and will stop Putin, and announcing that the allied nations of NATO will be providing more defense for Ukraine, and also talking about how an overwhelming bipartisan majority of Americans understand that NATO makes us all safer. These were high-profile remarks by the president as questions continue to swirl about his age and acuity. He, of course, during these remarks was reading from a teleprompter. We want to get some quick reaction now here on Bloomberg TV and radio from our political panel assembled here on Balance of Power. Alvin, Jordan, and Maura Gillespie are still with us. Alvin, first to you is, we were speaking before we went into the president's remarks about these concerns around his health and acuity at 81. Did he do what he needed to do with the speech this evening?
Yeah, I mean, he delivered it without any hiccups, so to speak, and I think that is just, more of what he'll have to do coming up. He has a full slate between now and I think the next week and a half or so. And so he, definitely has to stand and deliver for each of those appearances, whether they be, teleprompter or, kind of amongst the people, if you will. And so I think, any hiccups or speed bumps along the way, kind of put in jeopardy some of this kind of acquiescing we've seen in, from the Democratic Party, so to speak, up to this point. So.
Maura, feel free to weigh in on the performance that we just saw from Joe Biden. A lot of people were watching it specifically to see what his voice would sound like, what his body language would look like, but also the contrast he just drew. Giving that medal to Jens Stoltenberg, the contrast between his approach to NATO and Donald Trump couldn't be more stark.
Absolutely, and I think that was part of the reasoning of making sure the speech was so concisely delivered and strongly delivered, but it was to set apart this contrast of both how Trump views NATO, how Trump and his party and his team view Ukraine and our aid to Ukraine and our position as in the world. I think what I would say here is, yes, he delivered that speech well, and probably as well as he needed to. But again, it was scripted, and it was there for him on the teleprompter, even as he was bestowing the Medal of Freedom to Stoltenberg. So I think what we need to remember here is, both for Trump and for Biden, they cannot be trusted off the cuff. And what does that say moving forward? And we'll need to watch that for both candidates in the months ahead.
Well, And on that point, Alvin, it's worth pointing out, we will be hearing from President Biden at NATO again on Thursday, where he will be delivering a news conference. That's going to be the off-scripted moment. Is that really what counts?
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to that in the sense that I believe coming away from that, a lot of what we've heard over the last couple of days coming from these closed-door meetings on the Hill with Democrats will either be solidified or, we might see some walking back if he, maybe struggles there. But I would have to think that his team is fully preparing him for that, and I would hope and imagine that that's one that he can, for sure knock out of the park.
Mm-hmm. Is this just a big performance in this case at this NATO summit? Maura, do deliverables even matter? The president was talking about some important headlines for Ukraine, or are people specifically concerned and looking at the way that he's carrying himself?
The deliverables matter because our role in the world matters, and it's really important that we reaffirm that position. And so whether you are going to vote for Joe Biden or not, he is our president until January of 25. And so we need to encourage him to put the best foot forward he possibly can, because we want to present ourselves in a strong position. The rest of the world is watching what happens here, and they are concerned about what's going to happen come November, just as many of Americans are. And so it's really important that we should all want to our president on the world stage to present his best version, his best self. Nobody wants to see him stumble, I don't think. They shouldn't want to, because he represents us as a nation, and especially in a platform like this where it is with our allies, and the importance of reiterating our commitment to NATO is crucial, especially with what's going on around the world.
Finally, Alvin, in our final moment, knowing that many Democrats talked up this week as kind of a make or break moment for Joe Biden, how long does he really have to plead his case as to why he should be the Democratic nominee?
Oh, I think he still has plenty of time. I mean, much was made of the debate kind of being the earliest in recent memory, and so I think with that he'll have plenty of opportunity. But what you don't want are more moments to kind of make a trend out of what his team now is saying was just a one night in Atlanta.
Sounds like he has until Chicago.
I mean, that's the next checkpoint for sure.
He's got a month then, Kaylee.
Yeah, the clock is certainly ticking. Alvin Jordan and Maura Gillespie, our political panel this evening here on Balance of Power. Thank you so much. And of course, we'll look ahead to Thursday, Joe, when we do expect Joe Biden to give that news conference.
Yeah, another newsy day tomorrow as well. Jay Powell back on the Hill. We'll be talking about that a lot, with much more to follow on Bloomberg TV and radio. Bloomberg Investigates on Bloomberg TV, and Bloomberg Law in progress on Bloomberg Radio. We'll see you back here tomorrow, only on Bloomberg.